You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 402, recorded on Sunday, December 5th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This episode is going to tell the story of how the frontier family homeownership model, central to the U.S. political economy, finally incorporated the American urban industrial working class via mass production kit houses and automobile access between factories and available land, and via the new finance products necessary to allow them to purchase those newly available things. Several weeks ago, we did a multi-part series on American money in the 19th century, and our epilogue episode focused on early 20th century personal finance, from consumer payment plans to auto loans and home mortgages. This week's episode builds on that last point and focuses primarily on the early effects of new financial products on the physical design of single-family homes. As usual, we will also try to tie back to other episodes about how materials costs and physical innovations of the Second Industrial Revolution influenced design and lifestyle. The main sources for this week's episode will once again be Robert J. Gordon's densely researched 2016 book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, which we've now used as the jumping off point for a bunch of episodes on our show, and also a number of websites on historic housing stock in Chicago at the turn of the last century. As always, our notes will be posted as a PDF at arsenalfordemocracy.com with this episode. So let's do this as a before and after type of picture. Let's jump in starting with the workers' cottages that preceded the changes to American home finance in the period we're looking at this week. Then, after we look at those financing changes, we'll examine the rise of bungalows as a response to those changes. So, Rachel, we'll start with you first by talking about Chicago workers' cottages as an example of late 19th century, very early 20th century housing for, the working classes and so forth, that was starting to become more available to people, but doesn't really reflect the transformation that we're about to see in the 1910s and especially 1920s as personal finance and home finance really changes. So could you tell us a little bit about that to sort of set the stage for this transition that we're going to be discussing?
Yeah. So the Chicago workers' cottage was a type of housing built before the boom of the bungalow from the 1870s to the 1910s. And it was designed to be affordable housing for working and middle-class homeowners. The houses are quite small and narrow because they're made to fit on a pretty small city lot. Chicago's lots are about 25 feet wide. And they feature a fairly simple rectangular footprint and a peaked roof, a peaked gabled roof. So just kind of the pyramid shape, very, very simple, very easy to build. They're typically 1.5 stories tall with a short upper floor that can be used as an attic or an additional bedroom. There are some modifications on this basic style, such as 2 or 3 flat cottages, which are the basic cottage rectangle stacked on top of one another with the same peaked half-story roof placed on top. Most of these 2 or 3 story buildings were built as multifamily housing, just kind of split up into units for multiple families. Some models had a low basement with the first floor raised slightly off the ground and some windows put in, like kind of the typical window well you see in some older housing with a semi-exposed basement. And then some had the basement on the ground floor with the main entrance to the house a full story off the ground. But all of these were kind of basically built off that very simple rectangular design. There were financing plans that made these houses very affordable to workers. In a page from the 10th illustrated catalog of S.E. Gross's famous city subdivisions and suburban towns from 1891, the terms were spelled out. Price, $1,050 to $1,500, $100 cash, balance on long time and monthly payments of $9 to $11, same as rent. So Samuel E. Gross built thousands of worker cottages in and near Chicago. And at this time, Chicago was a prime location for growth because of its centralized location with access to natural resources, such as lumber from northern Wisconsin and Michigan. And it was just a booming industrial town at this time and a centralized hub in the nation for industry. So it was a very attractive place to build a bunch of housing and attract a lot of workers. So while most houses featured this plain rectangular footprint, some mass-produced embellishments such as stone and wooden ornamental details, were added to create visual interest and variety without significantly raising construction costs. Porches and bay windows were also common features on these houses. Slightly wealthier homeowners would build Queen Anne style houses with oriel windows and more complex roof structures. These were definitely more expensive and were outside the price range of your average worker, so it kind of was outstraining the definition of these workers' cottages. Another popular style was the Dutch colonial, which featured a higher, flatter roof that provided extra storage space on the top floor. This was also pricier than the basic gabled roof. This was kind of like a transition phase from kind of the tenement apartment housing to single-family home ownership. And you can kind of see that transition to the bungalow style that comes later. So by the end of the 1910s, the era of workers' cottages gradually came to an end, and the new style of brick bungalows emerged as the dominant form of small single-family home in Chicago. The bungalow style incorporated new design ideas from high-end prairie-style architecture on the exterior materials, as well as a more open layout on the interior. New technologies of central heating and modern kitchen appliances made the workers' cottage seem outdated and plain. The bungalow style is often identifiable by a low-hipped roof and central dormer, but some early bungalows may look a bit like workers' cottages, as one style gradually gave way to another. However, the style never really fully went away, and the small city lots in Chicago still kind of created these constraints on housing and architectural design. And in the 1950s and 60s, there was still a need for affordable housing in Chicago. So the ranch-style houses of the mid-century featured the same simple rectangular footprint and low gabled roofs that were combined with the modern conveniences such as the central heating and updated kitchen appliances that came later in the century.
I think that's a good way of summarizing it, because this isn't what we're talking about today is not, extremely distinctive phase periods where there's this total revolution. It is more of a transition, a gradual process, or as Gordon refers to it at one point, bungalows in particular, he views as the culmination of a number of processes. It is important to note that there were certain changes, and that's something that we're going to delve into a little bit more. Rachel just alluded to the issues around central heating, updated kitchen appliances being a euphemism for things like the arrival of, refrigerators, and transitioning away from manual ice boxes to, electric freezers and things like that, right? These are some of the changes that are happening during this period after the beginning of the 20th century, and we've certainly done episodes on those. And then subsequently, there's a lot more kitchen appliances in the post-war housing. But there's also a major change in financing, which is something that we talked about on previous episodes of this show. And again, that's also a gradual process to some extent. And so, Rachel talked about the payment plans, the installment plans for paying for these workers' cottages. But in general, the financing options became more generous, more easily available, more accessible to more people, and just generally structured in a more favorable way so that it was less onerous to do these things. We did talk, if you want to go back to listen to the multi-part series on American Money, in the epilogue episode specifically, you can hear us describe various different types of home financing plans for specific decades in the United States. But let's try to zero in on some of these changes that happened right around the early 20th century and into the 1910s, which were making the case here, as I think Gordon does in his book as well, that bungalows in particular are enabled by those changes in financing, and that even if some workers were able to obtain relatively good financing for those workers' cottages, the bungalows were similar, if not better, financing terms for getting you a lot more and an even better house. So let's get into that. So I'm going to read some quotes from the couple of pages, or from a few of the pages on home financing in this particular span in the Gordon book, and then we'll talk about the bungalows because he has 3 pages on that. I'm just talking about bungalows. Quote, the first provider of installment loans was the U.S. government. The Harrison Act of 1800 provided for the sale of public land to farmers for a down payment of 25% and 3 additional payments stretched out over up to 4 years. A total of 19.4 million acres of land in the Northwest Territories was sold in this way between 1800 and 1820. As early as 1890, census data show that 29% of homes in the United States had outstanding mortgages. For instance, in the Boston area, it was typical for a family to be required to save half of the purchase price, say $1,500 for a $3,000 house, and borrow the rest. Then a first mortgage would be obtained from a savings bank or mortgage dealer for 40% of the sales price, $1,200, and an interest rate of 5 to 6%, and a second mortgage was obtained from a real estate agent. Interest was paid semi-annually over 3 to 8 years, and the lump sum of principal was due at the end of the loan period. So again, that represents an earlier form of home financing, which is still used in some arenas of real estate financing, but generally you would not see this anything like that today in home financing. That's called the balloon payment method. So you're paying the interest in installments, but you still have to come up with a huge sum of money to pay off the principal at the end, as opposed to it all being added up together and then chopped up into payments over a really long period of time. And again, one of the things we talked about in those previous episodes of the show was the idea that the duration of the payment plans also changed. And in fact, you sometimes see, and I think my family has seen this in letters, right? That if you look at the 1920s, a lot of people who had already built or acquired homes refinanced their homes using these newer, more favorable mortgage terms that were stretched over longer periods, rather than having to stick with their less favorable original financing plans, which kind of goes to show you the transformation that was occurring at this time period. So let's talk about the new financing model that replaces this balloon payment system. Quote, the details of mortgage contracts differed between and within cities, with some loans extending for as long as 20 years. The largest holders of mortgage debt were individuals, savings banks, and building and loan associations. The latter, meaning building and loan associations, pioneered amortized loans in which the monthly payment included both interest and repayment of principal, so that no lump sum payment was due when the loan matured. Though the inclusion of principal repayment raised the size of the monthly payment, this was in many cases offset by extending the length of the repayment period. Amortized loans were a valuable innovation, for they reduced the risk to both the lender and borrower. By the 1920s, they had become standard. In the 1890s, most houses in Muncie, Indiana, to give an example, were built for rental, but the Linds estimated that in 1923, the rental portion had declined to only 10%. They attribute this change to the development of building and loan associations after 1900, which made it possible for many members of the working class to consider home ownership. In the mid-1920s, fully 75% to 80% of new Muncie homes were built for owners, with mortgages provided by 4 associations, and a bank executive estimated that 85% of those purchases were, quote, working men. Gordon also discusses in the book about financing for apartment building development projects in the 1920s, but we are trying to zero in here on this episode on the single-family homes. Quote, one reason homeownership rates soared in the 1920s as part of the massive building boom of that decade was a widespread loosening of credit conditions that allowed families to take out second and third mortgages. The value of outstanding mortgages soared from about $12 billion in 1919 to $43 billion in 1930, i.e., 16% at the beginning to 41% of nominal GDP at the end of that period. Mortgage debt for structures during the 1920s was consistently 7 times higher than for non-structures consumer debt. The longer view shows that the value of outstanding mortgages was roughly 20% of GDP from 1900 to 1922. So this was clearly an emerging sort of area of the economy. Quote, it was substantially easier to obtain credit for automobiles than for houses because the collateral for the loan was movable. And this helps explain why automobile sales grew so rapidly in the United States compared to other countries. There are contrasting views on how difficult it was to obtain mortgage credit. The Lynn statement that 80% of Muncie homes built in the 1920s were sold to owners and that many of these new owners were working class conflicts with Wood's unqualified remark that there was no mortgage finance available for families below the 50th percentile of the income distribution. Overall, the most important support of the transition from rental status to homeownership was the evolution of credit institutions. Between 1890 and 1930, mortgages became easier to obtain with lower down payments and more options for second and third mortgages. Homeownership rates crept up toward 50% in the nation as a whole. The positive stimulus from mortgage finance came at least temporarily to a halt as a result of bank failures in the early 1930s and revived somewhat in the late 1930s, and then changed completely to a much easier financial environment after World War II. So this brings us to the bungalow movement, right? We've now explored what came before the bungalow movement. We've looked at some of the evolution and improvements in home financing methods that would sort of supplant and make it easier to do better housing, single-family housing, than those workers' cottages that Rachel talked about. So let's get into the deal with bungalows. So Gordon argues in his book that one-story or one-and-a-half-story single-family bungalows, popularized shortly after the turn of the last century, served as a critical transition phase for urban industrial working-class families to become urban or inner-suburban middle-class families over the first half of the 20th century. Bungalows entered the U.S. first in Los Angeles in 1905 and then took off in populous industrial cities like Chicago in the 1910s and 1920s. Bungalows were financially obtainable, emerging in tandem with growing availability of home financing products, and these little homes built up wealth through home equity over a generation or two. Gordon paints a picture in the book of bungalows as sturdy, reliable, durable single-family homes that nevertheless were not wildly expensive, and with installment-based mortgages and other similar financial products for home financing, they were now within reach. He contrasts them explicitly with the late 19th century and pre-1910s workers' cottages that Rachel talked about, and he describes those as being lower quality, cheap housing that people were not keen to remain in nor trying to pass on to future generations. Chicago's bungalow belt today still occupies around 75 square miles or so. 80,000 of these homes were built in the 2 decades from 1910 to 1930 within Chicago, and another 20,000 were built nearby. They were relatively standardized in basic form. That's something we actually discussed in passing on our recently unlocked forest products episode when we brought up Sears Roebuck mass-produced kit home materials. But it was also easy to customize these bungalows, either initially or over time with additions or dormers. Bungalows were clad on the outside in low-maintenance materials like redwood, brick, or stone, depending on the region of the U.S. Obviously, Rachel mentioned that brick was the cladding of choice in bungalows in Chicago. And their square footage was about 1,000 to 1,200 square feet on the first floor and about 300 to 400 more above that under the roof, depending on the dormer situation. These homes could be built for about $1 per square foot plus labor and the underlying land purchase itself, which was typically for a lot of just 25 or 35 feet across in street frontage. That remained essentially the same as in the workers' cottage period. And after World War I, even with prices rising, a complete Sears kit would still run between just $750 and $2,000, and they assembled quickly. Obviously, that would have been a significant amount of money at the time, hence the need for home mortgages and so forth, but still, that's a lot more reasonable than a lot of things, and it really included a lot, as we'll talk about. To save on interior space and costs, the front door entered directly into a combo living room dining room with no Victorian-style vestibule, and that room was next to the kitchen. The standard kits even came with wooden furniture, cabinets, and flooring, which was definitely not the case in some of these previous single-family home options for people, and that makes a big difference too. When you're, engaging in all this home financing, you're going to want to get a lot for your money. Laborers assembling them could also draw on a wide array of mass-produced customization features and decoration accents. That was, of course, true for the workers' cottages as well, as Rachel noted. And Gordon notes that another design feature dictated by personal finance products becoming available in the 1910s and 1920s was automobile accommodation, as auto loans revolutionized car ownership and facilitated rapid urban sprawl. Quote, all bungalows were built with garages in the back, and every block was bisected by a service alley through which cars entered and from which garbage was collected. Poles for electric and telephone wires were all hidden away in the alleys, giving the Chicago streetscape a neat, clean look featuring landscaped parkways between the paved sidewalks and the street with trees planted in the parkways. Gordon also notes, outside of the question of home financing, that the materials costs themselves to build homes came down dramatically in the century prior to the bungalow trend. Again, this is where he describes them as a culmination of those production factor cost savings. Not only were the designs standardized and some of the fairly big components were mass-produced by the 1910s, but even some of the very basic elements of home building, like nails and thin-cut lumber, which would be 2x4s for a balloon frame instead of a heavy timber frame construction, these had become inexpensive and mass-produced at this point. Cheap nails alone dramatically cut the cost of building single-family homes. One study cited in the book found that the price of nails fell by 90% in real terms between 1830 and 1930. We might circle back to that point at some point as another sort of exemplary Second Industrial Revolution materials history topic for its own episode. But just as a quick summary, I wanted to briefly quote from the Wikipedia entry on the history of mass-produced and then automated nails from the 1860s to the 1890s. Which is as follows. Quote, with the introduction of cheap wire nails, the use of wrought iron for nail making quickly declined, as more slowly did the production of cut nails. In the United States in 1892, more steel wire nails were produced than cut nails. In 1913, 90% of manufactured nails were wire nails. Nails went from being rare and precious to being a cheap, mass-produced commodity. Additionally, Gordon notes in his book that things like plumbing and heating equipment were finally mass-produced in factories by this point as well, and they did not require handcrafting. And so that also represented a huge cost savings for the production and assembly of single-family homes. So by the time you get to about 1910, it is now possible to finance on generous and inexpensive terms a actually pretty solid quality home that had everything you needed in it, all the latest things. It did not break the bank. It was, all the costs of materials had come way down. The mass production was there to support these things all being thrown up and so forth. And that is the point that he makes, again, in terms of the significance of this beyond itself, is that these would be homes that could be passed along as generational wealth within a family. This is how you make that transition from the urban working class to the urban, or depending on how you define it, inner suburbs, middle class, over a period of about a half century, from, say, 1910 to 1950 or 1960. And I think that is significant to understand here, and it's sort of an interesting point that wouldn't really necessarily apply to some of the earlier types of homes. Even the workers' cottages, which at least externally kind of seem similar, you really drill down into it and you realize that those were simply not as good, they were not as durable, and they did not have as much included in them for basically similar, cost outlays and financing. So, Rachel, I wanted to get some of your thoughts on this. I thought it was really interesting, the way that he took this one specific thing and used it to kind of illustrate 10 different points about trends that had been building up in the United States over this period of the Second Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, and it seems like Chicago was definitely kind of a flashpoint for this transitional phase. Like, although the workers' cottages were somewhat cheaply made and not made to last generations, they did take the concept of the bungalow and just kind of explode during the 1910s and 1920s. So it seems like they were really able to strike while the iron was hot and just build a ton of homes. What was it, like 80,000 homes in just a few years? So it's pretty interesting how Chicago was kind of the flashpoint, and being such a booming industrial town at the turn of the century, they were able to really take advantage of this culmination of all these innovations happening at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, anyway, I thought that this was a good one to zero in on because we had talked about changes in home financing and also changes in auto financing on that recent series. But we'd also talked about things like kit homes and so forth. And bungalows were definitely mentioned very briefly in that, but with no further elaboration. And this is sort of a good way of illustrating some of the transitions in the United States. And it also is intriguing because previously, there had been this idea of like land being the underlying key to everything and you got to be a landowner and that sort of thing, but it was for stuff like farming, right? Or maybe you would get lucky and you'd have purchased something that had some valuable natural resource asset like timber harvesting or mining concessions or whatever. Maybe, depending on what era or what place in the United States, that could be your sort of ticket to prosperity. But generally, we're talking about various agricultural uses. Or you would say, someone, they're going to go off and do their own thing, really kind of removed from society, right? That's the sort of idealized stereotype anyway, not necessarily borne out in reality. And the question is, okay, how do you get from that to the urban working class also being able to join the ranks of homeownership and land ownership? And this is the sort of solution that squares all of those circles in a way that is very beneficial to the status quo and maintaining the status quo, as opposed to some of the other potential socio-political transformations that, say, Europe experienced, right? In this case, there was still a lot of land available around some of these major cities to rapidly spread out. But even then, you still have to come up with a way of it being cheap to not just buy the land, but also to build the house. And build a good quality house that you can pass on to future generations. And it really kicks in around 1910 that all of these factors converge, and that's how you get that sort of transition. And that then kind of locks everything into being America is first and foremost a society geared toward the preservation of the rights, privileges, and power of its assembled single-family homeowners all across the United States, including in these sort of inner ring areas, or even right into the urban core in many cases. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on this week to talk about bungalows, worker cottages, and home financing at the early 20th century. Another great entry in our ongoing series on these material history factors in the United States in this period.
Glad to be here. It was a great topic.